In the fall of 2005, a team of engineers arrived at a site in southwestern Illinois. They weren't archaeologists. They were geotechnical engineers, and they weren't there to study history. They were there to stop a landslide. The ground beneath them was moving, a massive slope sliding downward, inch by inch, threatening to collapse a structure that had stood for almost 1,000 years. This wasn't a hillside. It was a monument. It's called Monks Mound, and it's the largest prehistoric earthen structure anywhere in the Americas. Its base covers nearly 15 acres, roughly the same footprint as the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises about 100 feet into the air, and it was built entirely by hand, out of sand, silt, and clay, by people who left no written records, no blueprints, no names we can attach to the work. It sat at the center of a city. At its peak, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people lived around this mound, a population size much of Europe wouldn't see in a single settlement for centuries, fed by intensified agriculture and swelled by people arriving from across the wider region, drawn in by whatever this city had. Here's the number that should stop you. Builders moved somewhere between 22 and 34 million cubic feet of earth to raise this single structure. If one person had carried every load themselves, alone, without ever stopping, he'd still be hauling dirt more than 50 years later. This wasn't a pile of soil. It was one of the largest hand-built construction projects in human history. Picture it a different way. Stack that much earth into modern dump trucks, bumper to bumper, and the line would stretch for hundreds of miles. Every single load of it, moved by hand, without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools. And in 2005, part of it was falling apart. So the engineers standing on that slope in 2005 weren't just fixing erosion. They were trying to answer a question nobody had ever fully solved. How do you keep a mountain of loose earth standing for 1,000 years using nothing but hand tools? This mound wasn't built in one attempt. It went up in at least 14 distinct stages over roughly 3 centuries, each new stage added on top of the last like rings inside a tree, except every ring was built by a different generation, working from a plan nobody wrote down. Because here's what almost nobody realized for the better part of 2 centuries. The people who built this weren't guessing. They were engineering. And to understand what these engineers found underground in 2005, we first have to understand something stranger. For nearly 100 years, the United States refused to believe Native Americans built this at all. Not because of a lack of evidence, because of what admitting it would have cost. When settlers first crossed the Appalachians at the end of the 1700s, they didn't find one mound. They found tens of thousands of them, scattered across the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. Perfect circles 1/4 mile wide, geometric squares laid out with startling precision, octagons and circles connected by long, straight embankments, engineered to line up across miles of open land with an accuracy modern surveyors still find impressive. One shaped like a bird in flight, wings spanning over 600 feet. Structures on a scale that, in Europe, would have taken kings and empires to build. Whole communities stood at the base of these earthworks and tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they'd been told to expect from this continent: wilderness, emptiness, land waiting to be claimed. Structures this large didn't fit that story, so instead of updating the story, most people updated who they imagined had built them, and almost immediately, the people encountering them decided they couldn't have been built by the native nations already living beside them. By the 1830s, the federal government was forcibly removing those same nations from land east of the Mississippi. The myth wasn't confined to speeches and scripture either. It made its way onto popular lecture circuits that traveled from town to town, entertaining and informing whole communities at once, which meant an idea invented to justify taking land reached ordinary Americans as casually as a night out, and settlers kept finding these massive earthworks, obviously requiring organized labor on an enormous scale, right in the middle of the land being taken. That created a very inconvenient question. If Native Americans built these monuments, Doesn't that prove they had complex, advanced civilizations here? For a government trying to justify removal, the answer needed to be no. So a new story took over. The mounds, it claimed, weren't built by the ancestors of the people living there at all. They were built by a vanished race, wiped out, the myth insisted, by the very ancestors of the native nations now standing accused of destroying them. The theory didn't just erase an achievement. It rewrote the victims as the villains at the exact moment their land was being taken from them. Here's how far that bias went. In 1848, 2 surveyors produced the most detailed map of these earthworks anyone had ever attempted. Genuinely careful, valuable fieldwork, the kind researchers still reference today. Then, they used their own data to conclude that native peoples had what they literally called an aversion to labor. Real measurements, real maps, pointed at a conclusion the numbers never supported. A sitting president, William Henry Harrison, personally argued native peoples lacked the organization to build structures this precise. In New York, a preacher named Joseph Smith built an entire religious movement on top of the same idea, weaving a vanished, literate civilization directly into the founding scripture of a new faith. The same story even crossed the border. In Canada, researchers examining a mound on the Souris River reached the identical conclusion, describing the builders as a vanished, more industrious people, separate from the native nations living nearby. One excuse, repeated independently on 2 sides of a border, wherever the land itself was in question. Meanwhile, one man had already quietly proven the myth wrong, decades before it even peaked. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson excavated a burial mound in Virginia. He didn't invent a lost race to explain what he found. He just described it, layer by layer, with a precision most of his contemporaries wouldn't bother with for another 100 years. 3 years later, a minister named Manasseh Cutler tried something even stranger. He climbed onto a mound in Ohio and started counting, not artifacts, tree rings, on the trunks of ancient trees growing directly out of the earthworks summit. The count came back centuries deep, proof the mound had been standing undisturbed since long before any European ever set foot on the continent. The evidence was there the whole time. It just wasn't politically useful. For nearly a century, the myth won anyway. Then, in 1881, Congress did something almost unheard of. It funded a full federal investigation specifically to settle the question once and for all. The man running it, Cyrus Thomas, didn't set out to prove a theory. He set out to test one. His team spent years documenting burial patterns, artifact styles, and construction techniques across dozens of sites, comparing all of it against the living traditions of nearby native nations. In 1890, his findings were published, and they were unambiguous. There was no vanished race. There never had been. The mounds were built by the direct ancestors of the native nations still living beside them. A myth that had shaped presidential rhetoric and national scripture for 100 years collapsed under careful fieldwork. It came a century too late to change what had already happened to the nations it was used against, but it finally put the achievement back where it belonged. For most people, that was the end of the story. They'd finally answered who built the mounds. They hadn't. They'd only answered the easy question. Because once historians accepted who built them, they made a second assumption, almost without noticing they were making it. They assumed the mounds themselves were simple, just dirt, scooped up nearby, piled into a shape. For most of the 20th century, nobody challenged that assumption at all. It turns out, it was just as wrong as the myth before it. There's a pattern worth noticing here, and it isn't unique to this one myth. Real evidence sat in plain sight, in tree rings, in stratigraphy, in the direct testimony of the people who'd lived beside these mounds the whole time. And it still took a century and an act of Congress to become the accepted story. Information doesn't disappear from public memory by accident nearly as often as people assume. Sometimes it just becomes inconvenient, and inconvenient stories are the ones nobody bothers repeating. That assumption almost cost us the evidence to prove it wrong. In the 1960s, a researcher named Nelson Reed got permission to excavate the summit of Monks Mound, and brought in heavy machinery to strip away the upper layers quickly. Professional archaeologists were horrified. That machinery tore through centuries of undisturbed stratification, the exact layered evidence scientists would later need to date the mound's construction stages. Some of that story was gone before anyone thought to ask what it could have told us. What survived elsewhere was enough, because researchers had learned to read these mounds at more than one scale at once. In the field, they mapped entire construction stages, tracing the boundaries between one building phase and the next. Underground, they ran the same physical tests a modern construction site would run before pouring a foundation, checking how each soil type gripped, held moisture, and behaved under weight. 3 different scales, one structure. And the picture that came together from all 3 didn't look like a pile of dirt at all. If this is the kind of buried history you didn't know you needed, this is exactly what Forgotten Echoes goes looking for, so stay with us, because what's actually underground here is stranger than anyone expected. Modern researchers, using tools ancient builders never had, cracked open these mounds layer by layer. They cut thin slices of soil thinner than paper and studied them under a microscope, looking for mineral traces, weathering patterns, the fingerprint of exactly how each layer was placed by hand, centuries ago. And what they found inside broke the second myth even harder than the first one. They didn't use one kind of soil. They used 2. Actually, they used 5. 5 distinct types of earth, each one chosen for a specific job, the same way a modern engineer picks concrete for a foundation and steel for a frame. God blocks, cut from thick, root-tangled topsoil and packed along steep outer slopes where the roots worked like natural rebar, holding the earth together under pressure. Soil blocks, cut from deep clay layers with no roots at all, dense and heavy, built into stable inner cores, strong enough to bear ceremonial buildings on the summit above. God, no settling, no shifting. A foundation that behaved almost like poured stone, made entirely of hand-cut earth. John Tay Ao A.O. fills thousands of individual basket loads, each one around 55 pounds, dumped and packed by hand, one after another, after another, after another. Multiply that single 55-pound load by the millions of cubic feet moved at Monks Mound alone, and the basket becomes the real unit of measurement behind everything you've heard so far. Picture the workday itself. No wheelbarrows, no carts. A person cuts a block of clay, or fills a woven basket with dirt, and carries it up a slope, sets it down exactly where it belongs, and turns around for another. Thousands of trips a day, from thousands of people, coordinated well enough that generations later, geologists still can't find a single seam where the plan seems to have broken down. That coordination is its own kind of engineering, separate from the soil itself. Zoned fills, alternating bands of sand, silt, and clay, layered in careful sequence, engineered specifically to steer rainwater away from the mound's core instead of letting it pool inside. And veneers, a tightly packed clay skin applied to the outside, letting builders hold slopes steeper than loose dirt should ever be able to survive, in places reaching angles of nearly 35 degrees. Some of those outer skins were made from stark white silt, or bright red clay, chosen for color, not just strength, sealing a finished stage of construction, the way a signature seals a finished letter. None of this was random. This was a deliberate, repeated engineering language, used across hundreds of miles and hundreds of years, documented by researchers Sarah Sherwood and Tristram Kidder after years of cutting into mounds most people assumed had nothing left to say. One example makes it concrete. At a site on the Mississippi Sound, builders first marked out a ritual space with a low earthwork. Then, quickly, before the next rain could touch it, they sealed that space with alternating layers of sand, silt, and clay, a zoned fill, engineered specifically to keep water from soaking into what was underneath. Only after that was sealed did they cap the whole thing with a hardened outer surface. 3 deliberate stages, each one solving a problem the last one created. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere, a builder stood over a pit of raw earth and decided, This soil is for holding. This soil is for shedding water. This soil is for the skin on the outside. Nobody wrote that decision down. It survived anyway, buried in the dirt itself, for archaeologists to read 1,000 years later, which finally brings us back to that landslide in 2005. Because if these builders were skilled enough to engineer around water and gravity, something else had to be happening underground. And the answer is stranger than a simple structural failure. The people who built Monks Mound already knew it was failing, nearly 1,000 years before those modern engineers arrived. That is why Monks Mound is built almost entirely from local clay, and that clay contains a mineral called smectite, which swells when wet and shrinks when dry. The mound also has a flat summit, built specifically to hold ceremonial buildings, and a flat top does something a natural hill never does. It catches rainwater instead of shedding it. That water sinks down through the layers inside, and as it moves along the seams between different soil types, it slowly polishes them into smooth, slick surfaces. Geologists call them slickensides, and they're dangerously weak. Picture the difference between walking on dry tile and wet tile. Same surface, completely different amount of grip. Slickensides do that, underground, at the scale of an entire mound. In dry weather, none of this matters. But when heavy rain saturates the mound, pressure builds inside those slick seams, and the Earth's grip on itself starts to fail. When gravity finally wins, it isn't gradual. Whole sections of the slope give way at once, sometimes in minutes, after centuries of holding perfectly still. And the excavation record shows the people living here weren't caught off guard by this. They were fighting it actively for generations. They reinforced the slopes with heavy retaining walls of clay and packed sod, the exact same sod block technique used everywhere else on the mound, now repurposed as emergency armor against a failure they'd already seen happen once. They changed how they worked, building major new sections rapidly in dry summer months, specifically so rain couldn't get inside before the surface was sealed. At one point, excavators found a paved limestone floor deep inside the mound, with tall cypress posts driven into it. Those posts collapsed not long after they went up, tearing open a gully on the eastern slope. The builders didn't walk away from the damage. They filled it, buried it under a new stage, and kept building on top of the scar. They even added an entire new terrace along the southern base, likely built as a massive buttress, specifically to stop the mound's core from sliding outward. It worked for a while, the same way bracing a cracked foundation buys a building more years, not forever. For generations, people climbed the same slope their parents had repaired, then their children repaired it again, and around the year 1200, one generation couldn't. A massive slump on the mound's western side shifted the summit itself, and part of a 100-foot-long ceremonial building came down with it. Somewhere below, people who had grown up watching that building on the skyline watched part of their skyline disappear in an afternoon. This is usually where the story stops. A mound failed, life went on, but look at what happened immediately after, and it starts to look like something much bigger than a structural accident. High-status construction on the summit stopped completely. New buildings were pushed down to the lower terrace instead. Trash started piling up at the base of what had once been the ceremonial heart of an entire city. By 1300, the city around the mound was in serious decline, and when the eastern slope failed badly not long after, nobody repaired it at all. The silence itself is the evidence. For generations, every failure had been met with sod, clay, and labor within a season. This one wasn't. Whatever had once organized 10,000 people to answer a landslide with a construction crew, by then, could no longer do it. Cities don't lose that ability all at once. They lose it the way this mound did, one skipped repair at a time, until the gap between what's needed and what gets done stops closing. 600 miles south, in modern Louisiana, a different group of builders had already solved this exact problem 2,500 years earlier, using an almost opposite strategy. Around 1300 BCE, at a site called Poverty Point, builders raised a mound shaped like a bird in flight, wingspan 640 feet, height 72 feet. containing roughly 238,000 cubic meters of earth. Before we get to how fast they built it, there's something stranger buried in exactly where they built it. About 3 miles south, there's a much smaller, much older mound. It was already there when construction on the bird-shaped mound began, and it wasn't new even then. That smaller mound had been built somewhere around 3900 to 3600 BCE, more than 1500 years before anyone broke ground on the bird. And when researchers finally plotted every major structure at Poverty Point onto a map, they found something nobody expected: the bird-shaped mound, a smaller conical mound nearby, a flat-topped platform, and that much older, smaller mound 3 miles away, all sit on the same north-south line. Precisely. Structures separated by over 1,000 years of construction, aligned as if the builders of the newest one knew exactly where the oldest one stood and built around it on purpose. Nobody has fully explained how that knowledge survived for 1,500 years with no writing to carry it. But the ground remembers, even when the people who carried that memory don't leave a name behind. It's worth sitting with that for a second. 1,500 years is longer than the gap between the fall of Rome and right now. And somewhere in that stretch of time, without a single written record, someone still knew exactly where an older mound stood and built the next one to answer it. That's the world these builders were working in, long before the bird-shaped mound went up in 90 days. The bird-shaped mound wasn't even the first structure built here. Centuries earlier, around 1700 BCE, workers raised a smaller conical mound elsewhere on the site, over 20 feet high, long before anyone attempted anything on the scale of the bird. That earlier mound reads almost like a proof of concept, a smaller, simpler structure that let builders learn what worked before they committed to something 22 acres wide. By the time they broke ground on the bird-shaped mound, they weren't experimenting anymore. Soil analysis shows something the researchers didn't expect. It was built almost entirely in one continuous push, under 90 days, possibly as few as 30. There are no erosion layers inside it at all. No sign the surface was ever left exposed to rain during construction. That means a structure with the footprint of several football fields, over 70 feet tall, went up faster than most modern building permits get approved. Fitter roads. No metal tools, just people, moving earth faster than the rain could damage it. Around it, on 6 enormous ridges curving 3/4 of a mile, up to 5,000 people lived, cooked, and built on a scale so precise it wasn't even recognized as a deliberate design until aerial photographs revealed it in the 20th century. Families built homes of woven cane and mud along those ridges, raised children there, cooked over clay hearths their parents had built before them. Because there was no natural stone anywhere nearby, they invented their own workaround, hand-molding small clay balls, firing them hard, then using them to slow-bake food in sealed pits. A fix so effective, archaeologists still find thousands of them in the ground today. Heat the clay balls in a pit, drop in fish or meat, seal the whole thing with earth, and walk away. Hours later, dinner, cooked evenly, without a single piece of stone anywhere in the process, on a floodplain that simply didn't have any to offer. It's the kind of solution you only invent when you've genuinely run out of the obvious option and refuse to go without. And this wasn't an isolated settlement. Copper from the Great Lakes, stone from the Appalachians, materials carried from as far as the Florida Peninsula, all found here hundreds of miles from where they came out of the ground. That means someone carried them, on foot or by river, through territory with no roads, no maps, anyone's found, and no writing system to plan the route. Evidence of trade and pilgrimage routes stretching across an enormous piece of the continent, all converging on a single ridge of packed earth in Louisiana. People didn't just trade valuable materials here. They buried them on purpose, leaving finished stone tools and fired clay objects inside the mounds themselves as offerings, wealth deliberately taken out of circulation and put into the ground, in a landscape that flooded often enough to make every season feel uncertain. Researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison led by geotechnical engineer William Likos, are testing these soils directly right now, and their early findings suggest the builders compacted specific mixtures of clay, silt, and sand to precise density levels, something close to an engineered jamda composite, not unlike early concrete. Then, sometime between 1000 and 800 BCE, the people of Poverty Point simply left, not from war, not from any single disaster. The regional climate was cooling, rainfall was increasing, and the river routes the community depended on for trade and travel were shifting beneath them. The mound itself, elevated safely above the floodplain, came through the change completely intact. It was the human network around it that couldn't adapt fast enough. Who cites two completely different answers to the same problem. At Poverty Point, builders held their slopes to a steady 29.7 degrees and finished the entire structure before rain ever got a chance to test it. At Cahokia, engineers pushed their slopes even steeper, up to 35 degrees, and paid for that ambition with 900 years of maintenance. Even the ground preparation was different. At Poverty Point, builders burned away standing marsh vegetation and immediately sealed the scorched surface with fine silt before construction even began, so the foundation itself was already stable on day one. At Cahokia, builders leveled and cored the ground carefully, but they were working directly over a floodplain in a spot that stayed wet year after year in a way no single-season fix could ever solve permanently. One built in a single, uninterrupted push, engineered specifically so failure never got the chance to start. One built in stages across 3 centuries, constantly repaired, constantly adapting to failure as it happened. When something failed at Poverty Point, there was almost nothing to fix, because the design avoided the problem entirely. When something failed at Cahokia, the response was always the same. More sod, more clay, more labor, an answer that worked for 900 years and then, in the 14th century, simply stopped coming. Only one of them was built to survive 3,000 years. This is the part of the story where most people expect it to end, and it doesn't. Because the same failure that cracked open Monks Mound in the year 1200 was about to happen again 800 years later, and this time, nobody ancient was around to fix it. After Cahokia was abandoned around 1400, the mound was left to the forest, and for centuries, that was its saving grace. Tree roots spread across its slopes and quietly did the same job the ancient sod bulwarks had done, anchoring the topsoil in place almost by accident. The forest, without knowing it, was running the same defense the original engineers had built on purpose. The site passed through very different hands over the centuries that followed. French missionaries built a small church on its terrace in the 1730s, serving a nearby Illiniwek community until rival tribes forced them out. A trading post operated near its base decades later. Then French Trappist monks arrived, farming wheat on its upper levels and vegetables on the lower terrace, deliberately kept apart, safely above the floodplain that regularly drowned crops planted at ground level. The reason it still carries the name Monks Mound today. They had, without realizing it, rediscovered the exact advantage the mound's original builders engineered it for, height as protection from water. In 1831, a landowner building a house on the summit struck ancient human remains while digging a well, a reminder that the ground beneath every later use was never empty. Decades later, in 1864, a more careful owner named Thomas Ramey took over the site and tunneled 30 meters straight into the mound's north face, hoping the interior would reveal something about how it was built. It didn't. No chambers, no hidden structure, nothing but consistent, packed earth, layer after layer, exactly what a properly engineered mound should look like from the inside. Sometimes the biggest discovery is confirming there was nothing left to find, because it means the outside was never hiding a shortcut. Then, in the 1950s, the real danger came back. And this time, it wasn't ancient engineering that triggered it. It was modern infrastructure. Heavy industrial groundwater pumping nearby lowered the local water table, and underground, the mound's clay layers, the same swelling, shrinking smectite clay ancient builders had selected 1,000 years earlier, began drying out and cracking invisibly from the inside. At the same time, Park managers cleared the trees off the slopes to prepare the site for visitors, removing the exact root systems that had been holding the structure together since the 14th century. Nobody planning that decision was thinking about slickensides, or shrink-swell clay, or a repair strategy from the year 1100. They were thinking about parking lots and sight lines. In 1956, heavy rain finally found those cracks. Water poured into the dried interior, reached the old slickenside seams, and triggered a new wave of slumping. The same failure, 800 years later, which brings the story all the way back to where it started. In 2005, and again in 2007, major slope failures tore into the mound's northwestern corner and eastern side. Engineers traced the damage to the exact same clay seams Cahokia builders had been fighting 9 centuries earlier, using the same basic shear strength principles, the balance between friction, pressure, and water, that any civil engineering student learns today under the name Moore-Coulomb theory. The math was new, problem wasn't, and their solution echoed the ancient one almost exactly. They cut stepped terraces directly into the exposed slip surfaces, a staircase carved into failure itself, breaking up the smooth clay plains that let water find a path through, then recompacted the earth to preserve the mound's original profile. Where Cahokia builders had packed sod and clay by hand to armor a weak slope, modern crews used graded benches and compaction equipment to do the same fundamental job, interrupt the slick surface before water could use it again. Modern engineers, without fully realizing it, had just repeated a repair strategy. Mississippian builders pioneered 8 centuries before them. When those engineers arrived on that slope in 2005, they thought they were solving a modern landslide. They're right. They were finishing a conversation that had started nearly 1,000 years earlier. For most of American history, the real story of these monuments was buried under a myth invented to justify taking the land they stood on. It took an act of Congress just to establish who actually built them. It's taken modern soil science, decades more, to finally understand how. What's standing across the Mississippi and Ohio valleys today isn't a lesser cousin of Egypt's pyramids or Rome's aqueducts. It's a parallel tradition, built from a completely different material, solving the same problem, gravity versus ambition, and in at least one case, outlasting it by 3,000 years. Cahokia is recognized today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, placed on the same list as the pyramids at Giza and the temples of Angkor, a formal acknowledgement, however late, of exactly what these builders accomplished. Climate change is now bringing heavier, more volatile rainfall to this same valley, the exact condition that has triggered slumping here in nearly every era of the mound's existence. Modern shifts in the water table underground carry the same risk that caused the damage in the 1950s, drying and cracking the same clay layers ancient builders once selected with such precision. Conservationists monitor soil moisture inside the mound directly today, using sensors buried in the same layers Mississippian engineers once packed by hand. Engineers track groundwater levels nearby as well, watching for the same kind of drop that dried out the clay in the 1950s, because a mistake made once by an entire region's infrastructure is exactly the kind of mistake that could happen again without anyone connecting the dots in time. They manage vegetation carefully enough to anchor the topsoil without letting deep roots tear into the structure, and they've installed modern drainage systems designed to do exactly what those ancient zoned fills and clay veneers were built to do 1,000 years ago. Guide water away from the core before it ever reaches a slickenside seam. In a real sense, the engineering conversation that began at Cahokia in the 12th century never actually stopped. It just changed who was having it. Plenty is still unanswered. Nobody knows exactly how knowledge of that 1,500-year-old alignment at Poverty Point survived long enough to guide later builders, or how many other mounds still hide construction decisions nobody has tested yet. That's not a weakness in the story. It's the reason researchers are still out there, cutting thin sections of ancient clay, one soil sample at a time. Every answer this investigation has produced so far has opened up at least one more question underneath it. Who built them? Then how? Then why some failed and others didn't? Then how deep that engineering knowledge actually went? That's usually the sign a piece of history is worth taking seriously. Not that the questions run out, but that better ones keep replacing the old ones. Nobody who built the original retaining walls in the year 100 could have known engineers would still be answering their questions 900 years later. They didn't need to know that. They just needed the mound to still be standing when someone finally asked. That's the part easy to miss in all of this. Every generation that repaired that slope was making a bet they'd never see paid off. That someone, centuries later, with tools they couldn't imagine, would still find the mound worth saving. They were right. If you want to be here for the next forgotten story like this one, the kind that was buried on purpose and had to be dug back up twice, staying with forgotten echoes, is how you'll find it. The mounds are still standing. The ground beneath them is still moving, just slightly, the way it always has. Somewhere under a flat summit in Illinois and under 6 curved ridges in Louisiana, water is still finding the same seams it found 1,000 years ago and 3,000 years ago, testing the same decisions ancient builders made about clay and sand and slope. So far, in the places it matters most, those decisions are still holding. And somewhere in that motion is 1,000 years of engineering knowledge, still quietly proving itself, one rainy season at a time.